June 2014. For many, it would go on to be a June like any other, but for those excited for news about their favorite games, E3 would take center stage. Thousands of people attending or tuning in to hear what their favorite companies had in store for the future. And when it came time for Nintendo to present, they'd immediately begin with quite a spectacle. But wait, pause there for a second. Looks like Nintendo is taking a stab at Toys to Life figures. That should prove to be interesting. And interesting it would be, because once these little toys hit the market, it would lead to one of the most bizarre phenomenons Nintendo had ever caused. Hello everyone, this is the RPG Monger, and today let's dive into what I like to call the Amiibo Crisis of 2015. Collectibles. If you're anything like me, then it can sometimes be pretty hard resisting the urge to impulse buy them in bulk, since while they can sometimes be pretty cool, more often than not, they're pretty standard merchandise marked up for far more than it costs to make it. In gaming alone, they've become borderline synonymous with just about every gaming company out there having a wide range of merchandise based on their IPs. In turn, it'd be no surprise that after a good while, Nintendo would like a piece of the pie as well, creating a series of figures called Amiibos. However, these wouldn't just be ordinary run-of-the-mill figurines. Instead, alongside being a nice thing to put on a shelf, these figures came equipped with RFID technology, which allowed them to send and store data with the games they were compatible with. In actuality, this wasn't the first time Nintendo had dabbled with this kind of technology, as after seeing the successes of Activision's Skylanders series, games that innovated the industry by utilizing NFC figures that could interact with the game, Nintendo would release Pokémon Rumble U, a game that just like Skylanders would accompany the release of its own set of figures, usable through the NFC reader built into the Wii U gamepad to enhance the game. Though of course, Rumble U was more of a proof of concept for Nintendo than anything, as like you'd probably guess, their actual grab at the NFC figure market would be Amiibo. I mean seriously, being able to both have a figure and train it to fight in Smash? Who wouldn't want such a cool concept? However, as Nintendo would soon come to regret, not all Amiibo were created equal. Since when the figures were physically being made, there was a bit of a bias when it came to which characters would be stocked consistently. Of course, the main characters of large properties like Mario and Link would be made in abundance, but side characters or characters from slightly lesser series like Marth of Fire Emblem and surprisingly Meta Knight of Kirby wouldn't be. At the time, Nintendo didn't think much of it, imagining that the average consumer wouldn't be as likely to get less popular characters over the popular ones. And honestly, looking back, that was probably the worst way they could have ever approached it. The state of the figure line only getting more insane the longer certain figures were scarce. But let's not go too far ahead. To start things off, let's go to the release of Nintendo's first Amiibos, Wave 1. Coming out late into 2014 on November 21st, demand for Amiibos would skyrocket, fans wanting figures of their favorite characters far more than Nintendo had ever planned to stock. In turn, a mere few weeks after the Wave 1 set had released, Amiibo for characters like Villager, Wii Fit Trainer, and Marth had become virtually non-existent, with any others that weren't Mario, Pikachu, Link, and Peach being harder to find as well. And when collectibles become hard to find in the standard market, there's only one thing that can happen: scalpers. To Nintendo's dismay, at the tail end of 2014, the Amiibo craze had led to the beginnings of an Amiibo crisis, with eBay auctions for rare Amiibo becoming absurd. I mean, remember, for the most part, Amiibo only cost around $12 across the board. Keeping that in mind, these figures had become so sparse that characters like Samus and Wii Fit Trainer were selling online within the $50 range, with characters like Villager and Marth being even worse, selling for upwards of $120. Plus, aside from scalpers being scalpers, some defect Amiibo would also make their way into the market, with the two most notorious ones being a Samus with 2 arm cannons and a legless Peach, the former going for $2,500 and the latter going for an enormous $25,000. It really was a crazy time, and not the greatest look for Nintendo either, though that's just Wave 1. What about the rest of the Amiibo to come? Well, not too long after Wave 1 was released, Nintendo would put out its second wave of Smash Amiibo, continuing the practice of stocking less of characters they deemed to be less in demand. As a result, just like Wave 1, whereas characters like Zelda and Luigi were always in stock, the other 4 in Wave 2 weren't, leading to many storefronts looking something like this. If that isn't the saddest picture, I don't know what is. And to make matters worse, not too long after the initial shipment of Amiibo, false rumors about Nintendo discontinuing certain figures would spread fast, fueling the combined craze of every collector even further. So going into 2015 with Wave 1 and 2 out and the scalpers thriving like never before, the Amiibo Crisis of 2015 had begun. Now you'd think that seeing how massive the demand was for the so-called less popular characters, that Nintendo would wisen up and equalize the amount of figures stocked, right? Well, unfortunately, it only got worse before things got better, as with the release of Wave 3 in early February, Nintendo would start making certain Amiibo store exclusives. So on top of Nintendo's stocking practices, now certain figures would be even more scarce, with 4 out of the 11 Wave 3 Amiibo being store exclusives, which once people learned what Amiibo would sell where, those stores would be stormed with ravenous collectors, making sure they could get the exclusives before anyone else, depleting the already small stock in no time flat. And if you're thinking, well, if it's so hard to get them once they're released at the store, why not just pre-order them? You'd be sorely mistaken, since because of how Nintendo made set quantities of characters, pre-orders would be extremely limited, unlike how pre-orders work for a standard game, leading to the pre-orders for those aforementioned exclusives selling out almost immediately. Hell, on that note, a bit before Wave 3 was released to the public, there was a guy who pre-ordered over 100 Rosalina amiibos just because he hated the character and didn't want other people to get her. It just goes to show how massive the craze was in early 2015 to drag weirdos like that out of the woodworks. And aside from the Smash amiibo, Wave 3 would also be host to an entirely new series centered around Mario characters, with the Gold Mario amiibo, of course, being a Walmart exclusive that became ultra rare in no time at all. Plus, on top of all of that, at the same time Wave 3 would drop in America, the West Coast port labor dispute was ongoing, only further constraining the already shoddy situation. At this point, this is when I originally got swept up in the Amiibo craze. 14-year-old me going store hopping searching for those ever rare figures. If anything, that's honestly the main reason I have most of my Amiibo, but I never did end up getting any of the really rare ones. I was pretty proud of snatching up a DDD though. Believe it or not, he was pretty hard to come across at one point. So anyways, moving on from the Wave's launch, you'd think Nintendo would realize that they had a bit of a situation on their hands by now, right? Well, thankfully they did, expressing shock at the amount of figures being marked up for insane prices online. But unfortunately, even though they'd now recognized that the way Amiibo were being handled wasn't exactly the best, things wouldn't change too much just yet, since due to the process of producing Amiibo and shipping them out not being the quickest ordeal, even though Nintendo now acknowledged that resupplies are going to be much needed, those resupplies won't actually hit stores for a good bit of time, prolonging the chaos as a side effect. Though even then, it was good seeing the company finally take steps in the right direction. The only problem was that now, going into April, Wave 4 would prove to become an Amiibo war. Immediately starting off on April Fool's Day, funnily enough, Wave 4 would be announced in a Nintendo Direct, with retailers opening pre-orders soon after. Now, taking note of everything we've seen happen so far, it's pretty obvious what'd soon follow. In no time at all after pre-orders went live, GameStop would be the war's first casualty, its site being so swamped with pre-orders, both online and in store within such a short amount of time, that not only would the site straight up crash, but even the chain's in-store registers would stop working. It was a situation that was truly emblematic of the entire crisis, and GameStop wouldn't be the only one inflicted. Why, just look at Target, who once their pre-orders were let loose, would sell out of certain Amiibo in less than an hour, with Jigglypuff, Target's store exclusive for that wave, disappearing in a matter of minutes. Though pre-orders are just that, right? We already discussed how flawed they were, especially with how Nintendo was treating Amiibo, so it's not the biggest surprise it ended up this way. At least people had the in-store release to look forward to, right? Well, yet again, not at all. Because since Nintendo hadn't properly communicated with the retailers on how much stock would be going their way, Amiibo like Robin and Lucina, once again from Fire Emblem, would become the new unfindable figures, with some stores surprisingly receiving no stock of them at launch. So once Wave 4 had officially dropped, the crisis had finally reached its peak, showing Nintendo that they'd need to be a whole lot more proactive when it came to their ever-popular Amiibo. But let's pause here for a second. second. As you've probably noticed, I've solely been focusing on the state of Amiibo in the US. That's because, to be frank, the Amiibo crisis was at its worst there, with the aforementioned port strike and poor management worsening things on a far different level. Though that isn't to say other countries wouldn't get their taste of the crisis either. Just take the great UK Amiibo heist. Whether or not the thieves knew what they were stealing is debatable, but near the tail end of Wave 4, when stores were due to receive the special edition of Splatoon, packaged with an exclusive Inkling Amiibo, UK stores would get a whole lot of nothing, as the truck that had the entire stock was stolen. At this point, you kinda have to feel bad for Nintendo, since when it came to Amiibo, they just couldn't seem to catch a break. But like I said before, this would be the turning point of the crisis, as after the initial release of Wave 4, Nintendo finally began to learn how to properly manage the Amiibo line, with those aforementioned restocks finally seeing the light of day starting in May and June. At first starting out as barely a trickle with new Marth Amiibos entering circulation, soon other rare Amiibo would receive restocks out of nowhere, bandaging the situation somewhat, as online prices for Amiibo like Marth would no longer be as absurd as they once were. Then, once Wave 5 hit the market in late June, both Nintendo and retailers alike had finally learned how to handle things correctly, with Nintendo stocking the new figures far more than previous waves, and retailers making sure their stock wouldn't disappear immediately. Amazon only allowing one Palutena per customer, and Best Buy not allowing pre-orders or online orders at all, limiting the Dark Pit Amiibo to one figure per customer as well. On a side note, it is worthy to mention that Amazon had actually been utilizing the practice it used with Palutena towards the end of Wave 4, only allowing one figure per customer and even creating allotted time windows for each figure to help prevent orders from getting too chaotic. Now, taking everything into consideration, this isn't to say Nintendo has completely redeemed themselves just yet, as there's really no way you can bandage a crisis of this magnitude overnight. But with Wave 5, they sure were trying to. I mean, seemingly at random, stores would now begin receiving mass restocks of all sorts of Amiibo, with the more rare ones receiving targeted restocks in the months to come. Though as a side effect, what with there being so many figures now, some older Amiibo would still receive less attention and retain their hard-to-find status, albeit nowhere near as bad as before. Going into Wave 6 and beyond, the company would maintain this trend, having seemingly gotten a grip on Amiibo and patching up the crisis completely. The only question now is, what would happen to Amiibo next? Well, coinciding with the last death throes of the Amiibo crisis, as Nintendo got their act together, the massive spotlight Amiibo had gained due to being so challenging to collect would fade alongside, the figure line joining the rest in the ever-growing ocean of collectibles. Though that isn't to say all Amiibo are easy to get nowadays, as out of all the Amiibo released, there are still some that will go for over triple their original price. Whether it be due to a figure being a store exclusive to Toys R Us, a store that's all but shriveled away, or Nintendo just not seeing the consumer demand for certain figures enough to consistently restock them. Plus, honestly, once the majority of the Smash Amiibo came out, any other Amiibo series Nintendo released would have pretty paltry uses in-game, from just being used for extra content that didn't amount to much, to being the absolute worst thing I've ever purchased in my entire life. Look, okay, I can explain. When Amiibo Festival came out, I still had the mass collection mindset of the crisis, so I more so bought it for the Amiibo it came with, even though later on it turned out they weren't even exclusives. I was pretty stupid, I know. But to be fair, in-game uses aside, some of the later Amiibo would still be worth it just as a collectible. Like, you can't tell me that the Guardian Amiibo doesn't belong on a shelf. And for the most part, a lot of these figures just look pretty nice. Anyways though, at the end of the day, the Amiibo crisis of 2015 serves as a lesson to all companies that even if you're absolutely sure of yourself, never ever underestimate consumer demand. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more like it, do subscribe, and today's cool thing of the day is the Final Fantasy VII Remake. Square Enix is truly back, man, god damn. Like, I've played a good few solid remakes in my day, but this is already my favorite game of the year and I haven't even finished it yet. The combat is great, the music remixes are fantastic, hell, the added content and banter between characters alone is something I'd pay full price for. Whether you've played 7 before or not, you're doing yourself a disservice by not playing this remake. And if you want to watch yours truly play it, I'm actually streaming it now on Twitch. So that being said, I'm the RPG Monger, and don't forget that each and every one of you are fantastic.